With this next, hopefully still fairly short video, I want to tease through some of the implications of making the concept of learning and inquiry one of the pillars of the new PIES 2.0 model, approach, framework, formula, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot in this, and some of these things need pulling out a little bit more. We had talked of the importance of dialogue in development of PIEs, thinking initially primarily about encouraging reflective practice at frontline level, and the importance of that running through the whole of the organisation to become what we've sometimes called a learning organisation, developing a culture of inquiry within the organisation, and suggesting that at locality level that same process of learning and inquiry and dialogue and development is equally important in getting services working together, covering gaps, system change, PIE of pathways as we've sometimes called it. But here I want to move up one tier further and look at how the whole PIEs idea as an idea is itself evolving and developing through what I'm calling a cycle of practice-based learning. And I want to tease out how that idea adds to and goes beyond the idea of evidence-generating practice, which is primarily about developing an evidence base for the effectiveness of PIEs, both to confirm but also to direct how we see these ideas moving through. And what I want to stress here is that we're not just talking about research evidence, but practice-based learning. And for this, I think the broader concept of dialogue and development in learning and inquiry is a little clearer. So let's look first at the various different elements involved in a cycle of practice-based learning. Here we have a cycle of several different elements, and let's colour code it to make it a little easier to follow where we're going. So we're beginning with, I would suggest, the PIE framework itself, particularly as we first suggested it and as we then started writing about it in the beginnings of this decade. And what that did, as it was seized upon really within many parts of the sector, it launched, or it certainly added extra momentum to a whole really quite extensive process of developing staff training and support, which we'd identified as one of the key areas, and also the opportunities for developing through consultancy and mentoring and a whole string of ways of working within a staff team, and also at middle and senior management levels, adding input into the idea of what it is that we're trying to do here and where we're going. And what this led to and encouraged and built on was development in frontline services, and that's the essence of a PIE. It's something where what the service actually does has learnt from and developed through this cycle. What we then see is, in some cases, formal research which is published in journals and so adds to the recorded formal evidence base. But much of the real learning and much of the development happened more informally through what you might call, within an organisation or between organisations, action learning, but generalised out into a wider picture in discussions in local forums and sometimes through conferences where people talk about what they're doing, and have added to this kind of gradual growing momentum and also the increasing diversity of the idea of what a PIE is and where we're going with it. So we have a cycle here as this information then feeds into what we understand a PIE to be and how a PIE develops. So let's look at that now in a slightly more focused way. Up here, top left, we have the idea, the PIEs framework itself, leading to staff training, support and consultancy, which is developing and encouraging a whole string of action learning ways of approaching. Ray Middleton and his group with the Fulfilling Lives programme up in Newcastle Gateshead, using what he calls the open dialogue approach. Others Peter Cockersell, for example, down in St Mungo's, and now working in other areas, working with a more psychodynamic approach, looking at where difficult to manage emotion goes and flows and gets blocked within a system and gets acted out in different ways. You've also got people looking at the whole system, that whole PIE pathways approach, and looking at brokerage to have system change rooted in the actual difficulties of individuals who we know by name. A fantastic version of action learning, I think, at system level. We then, in other areas, get people like John Connolly, for example, in his clinical work, working within the health service, using ideas that are very comparable to the PIE idea, working on Jay Levy's concept of pre-treatment and bringing that back into therapy settings in an approach he's now writing up and calling pre-treatment therapy. And there's a string of other approaches. The strengths model in particular, and I very much like the work that Suzanne Quinney did with hostels in London way back 5, 6, 7, 8 years or so ago, looking at bringing the strengths out of what's working well here and how do we do that best. And that's a sort of asset-based community development approach as applied to the communities in homelessness. And there are a string of other possible ways of working and a whole string of different issues and focuses for a particular staff team in a particular setting, all of which lead to practice development in frontline services through thinking through together, and what we've called reflective practice. So this then gets turned into, as I was saying earlier, in some cases actual published research which appears as part of the formal evidence base, but the great bulk of learning here has never been formalised in that way. It's more an understanding and a shared momentum of enthusiasm within the practitioner and to some extent the commissioner sector. And that is then expressed as best we can through the PIElink, for example, but organisations like Homeless Link in their conferences, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, the US equivalent, and FIANSA on the continent, on European, Making Every Adult Matter, the Fulfilling Lives programme. They have discussions with themselves at the moment, but that's all going to be published and is starting to come out now. Then we have the Faculty of Homelessness and Health Inclusion. We've got the Institute of Mental Health and Royal College of Psychiatrists, a whole string of different organisations picking up bits of this and promoting it in their own way. And what I've been trying to do with the PIElink is develop a place where all this can be held and where it can be shared, and it gets difficult to navigate. I've had to do a lot of rejigging to try and make it a little easier to find the stuff we're after. And that's then led to the development of a working party looking at a self-assessment framework for PIEs. We've called it the PIES, the PIEs self-assessment and specification framework, so that there can be more dialogue and discussion between providers and commissioners over how we work together. And that's then going to feed into some of the new discussions just starting to come through about commissioning for complexity and a really very different way of understanding the relationship between providers and purchasers in this new public management economy within which we all work. A lot of interesting new ideas coming through here just at the moment. So here we have the evolution, the evolving PIEs framework, picking up all of this information about what is working and developing it. So finally, that cycle of dialogue and development, the still evolving PIEs framework, staff training, support and consultancy, working with frontline and middle management services, possibly with commissioners as well. Development in frontline services that arises out of this, rethinking and bringing new responses to issues and challenges. And some of this then getting brought into the formal research, much of it being shared in a string of other venues and ways. And that practice-based learning being every bit as important, in fact at the moment probably far more important than the formal published research, because published research is always years behind the development of practice. So here we have a cycle of practice-based learning reflecting that learning and dialogue and inquiry approach, starting at the frontline in services, working its way through the whole of the organisation, developing into local partnerships and commissioning and needs mapping and gapping and so on, and then gradually feeding up into national and increasingly international discussions about how we learn, how we develop and how we go forward. So at each of these levels, that concept of learning and inquiry has tangible expression, and that's where we are now going with this whole approach. One last thing before we move on. How useful is it really to have all of these issues at all of these different layers and levels within the organisational hierarchy? How meaningful is it to try and have one theme, one phrase, learning and inquiry, to cover everything from reflective practice at the front line, culture of inquiry, forums and discussion, right up to commissioning and policy making and so on? Is it actually useful to have them all seen as being aspects of different levels of the same thing? And that's a question that we'll come to in one of the next videos, looking at complexity and looking at the mutual reinforcement of having a common language.